That's why you had all these sanctions taken all at the same time, brutally by everybody without any concession, all the condemnation from the UN General Assembly and all that. And the US made every effort to have kind of a unanimity against Russia, because the purpose was to have achieved this kind of collapse within weeks. But it didn't happen. And Switzerland, in my view, didn't understand the opportunity here, because instead of playing the neutrality card, it complied with what the EU and the US were asking for. That means a compliance with the sanctions. And as of today, Switzerland is, depending how you count, but it's the second or the third country that applies the more sanctions on Russia. The first one being the US, and then the second is, depending how you count, either the Switzerland or the United Kingdom. But that depends a little bit how you count. I remember the Washington Post made an article in October last year showing that Switzerland was the second most sanctioning country towards Russia, which is quite odd because Switzerland has no tradition in using sanctions as a way of foreign policy. On the contrary, Switzerland tried always to have kind of a mediatory position and stand in the middle and help to solve issues from both sides. How come can they come to the position of being even a candidate for a position in the European Union and things like this? Is that those people should have disappeared from a public life since years, because they have demonstrated their incapacity, their inability of leading or managing situations. They are institutional stupid. This is amazing. And what will come next is apparently not better. As long as we can anticipate who will come next, maybe we can be surprised by some miracle. But as of today, what we can see shows that we are going from disaster to disaster. And we are getting in even more complicated situations, because beyond complex situation on the ground, and the conflict or the solution of the conflict in Ukraine is obviously complex, even if the solution would have been very simple 3 years ago, today it becomes more complex. These people, all these people, are in charge of entities. For Ursula von der Leyen, this is obviously the European Commission, and this is the executive part of the European Union. Keir Starmer with the UK, France, and Emmanuel Macron with France, and Friedrich Merz with Germany. And all these entities have very important problems inside: budgetary, fiscal problems, social problems, everything. But they keep focusing on the situation in Ukraine. And when you listen to Kaja Kallas, who is the Foreign Ministry of this is the head of the External Action Service of the European Union, which is de facto some kind of foreign ministry of the European Union. When you have the problem with Iran, with China, with Israel, she's totally silent or incapable of issuing any kind of intelligent on that. Everything she does is related to Russia, because she comes from Estonia, which is a tiny country in Europe. And the fact that Estonia has been historically pro-Nazi during World War II, by the way. And that's the reason why, by the way, Soviet Union occupied this country even after the World War II. As the other Baltic states, they were all pro-Nazi during World War II, including the father or the grandfather, better said, of Kaja Kallas. So had this sense that Soviet Union and today Russia are their worst enemy, and there is nothing else to talk about than Russia. The essential problem, when we talk about Gaza with Europeans or the US, especially with Lindsey Graham now, they automatically link the problem to Hamas. And I think this is a kind of obsession that you have in the West, which is explained, or you can explain that by the fact that we tend to be trapped by the word terrorist. The word terrorist or terrorism, especially in the US, has been used and abused, I could say, to define. It has become not a technical term, but a political term. It defines people you don't want to talk to. So Iran is a terrorist state and Russia is a terrorist state. And so when you don't want to talk to someone, you just say he's a terrorist. And then everything is said, then you are allowed to do everything. You're allowed to cut economic ties, political, diplomatic ties, everything. The problem is that terrorism, and even if there is no agreed international definition of that, it is an activity, it's a method, it's a combat method. It's not an ideology, it's a way of doing things. And we tend to forget that, and we tend to apply the word to anybody. But if you examine, and I tried to review the activities of Hamas, especially when I was doing this book, the Al-Aqsa Flood, I studied, and it's not the first time, because I wrote already a book in 2003 on asymmetric warfare. Recently, you had in France, for instance, the head of the equivalent of the chief of the Joint Chief of Staff, or the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff in France, which is the Chef d'État-Major des Armées, who explained that France is now the main target or a defined target of Russia. Where does he get that from? Nobody has ever said that. I've never heard that. Never. And why should France be the primary target of Russia? This doesn't make any sense. Meaning that those guys, and when I say those guys, military people, who are supposed to be those who make the decision based on what they see on the ground. Because at the end of the day, you fight the enemy you can identify. You don't fight if you have nothing in front of you. So you need to have a very good reconnaissance and knowledge of what is in front of you. This guy is just inventing out of the blue a threat, and is in fact planning the development of a French army based on an imaginary threat. We managed to talk at that time. Today, we cannot. That means that beyond the geopolitical facts and geopolitical relations, there is something more. And this something more is probably in the psychology, the professionalism, the intellectual capabilities also of the leadership that we have, especially in the West. Because here also we see a distinct difference between the leadership we have in countries such as Russia, China, Iran, we can mention, or India, for instance, in Asia at large, where the leadership is obviously much higher standard than in the West, where you have people like Kaya Kallas, these people who don't understand, who are not even able to manage problems in their own country, who are obsessed with Russia, China, whoever. And once you try to argue or try to oppose or let's say challenge the decision or the leadership, then you're automatically qualified as a terrorist. And that happens in France, in UK. When you start demonstrating for Palestine, then you are considered a terrorist. This is something that we never had in Europe before. People demonstrated for the Palestinian, and in particular when the Palestinians were in fact demonstrably terrorists in the 60s or 70s. You had demonstrations in Western Europe for them. Demonstrators were not considered as terrorists. You had the repression and you had all that, as you have today. Didn't change much, but because it's nice to say Macron will recognize the state of Palestine and all that, even if this is the 10th time he says so, I don't expect much from him. But in any case, we see that beyond words, no Western country is ready to act. When it comes to Russia, everybody, not everybody, but some countries are ready to send troops in Ukraine and send troops to protect Ukrainians. And so when it comes to Palestinians, nobody mentions even that. Even they can even agree on using, for instance, peace enforcement for the Palestinians. This would be a possibility. You have peacekeeping, where once you have a peace agreement, then you maintain peace by having troops. That's what you have in Lebanon, for instance. And when you cannot reach an agreement, then you can have what the UN calls peace enforcement, mean that you send troops in order to bring the parties to the negotiation table, meaning that you enforce a negotiation, a peace through negotiation. And that's something that would be legally feasible, but nobody wants to do it. And that shows how the Western politicians are cowards, because we have all the legal instruments to do that. One important one is the decision of the International Court of Justice, who confirmed the fact that any Israeli presence on the Palestinian territory is illegal. Any Israeli in the West Bank, in Gaza, wherever, these people are illegally there. And that should make, and when you talk about the 17th century in France, when you said the century of the Enlightenment means that the decision is enlightened. Enlightened means that the decision is rational, is no longer something inspired by God.
Yeah.
It's a decision that comes out of a factual analysis of the situation, a factual analysis of your national interest, a factual analysis of the interest of the population. And that should make your decision making then to the benefit of the country, to the benefit of the population, to the benefit of the people who elected you. And that's the reason why intelligence, and I speak especially of strategic intelligence is an important, if not an essential part of this rule of law, where your decision making is based on facts, not on feelings. But why? Because our current leaders are so weak intellectually, they tend to not understand the need of having this intelligence, let's say, assessment. And by not being directly involved in a conflict, you could adopt a posture of mediation and help to mediate in the conflict. Even if you have a preference, although a good mediator doesn't have any preference, he mediates, so he's in the middle. But even if you have a preference, then you try to accommodate the two and try to, ideally, this would have been done before February 2022, but European Union didn't. Therefore, we went into a conflict situation in which the Europe was not prepared for and has no strategy whatsoever to address the problem. And that applies, you mentioned Switzerland, that applies to Switzerland the same. Switzerland, also, we have to acknowledge, because of the pressure made by the European Union and the US, by the way, on the government of Switzerland, in order to have, because the idea in February 2022 was to isolate Russia completely from the rest of the world, completely. The idea was to have no line of communication with Russia. And that's why, by the way, the European Union still struggles to have China condemning Russia and all that. As of today, it doesn't make any sense, but they continue to have that. Because the idea that the West had in February 2022 was this brutal and very stiff isolation of Russia would bring the collapse of the government in Russia, and therefore the collapse of Russia. That was the idea, and which is essentially based on the situation in the West Bank and the situation with the Hamas at the time. And even at that time, I had a very hard time to define exactly who and why Hamas is terrorist. It's certainly a resistance movement. That's something it cannot be denied. But you have different methods to resist. You can have peaceful resistance, civil resistance. You may have different way of resisting. Terrorism might be one. But I don't see, especially since 2005, since Hamas took over in the Gaza Strip, it's very hard to find evidence or example of terrorist act of Hamas. You can probably have those examples in the late 80s, early 90s, when Hamas was created and was defining itself. But since the early 2000s, when the Hamas decided to become a political movement and started to take part into local elections and then the parliamentary election in 2005, you can see a radical change in the doctrine. And that's, by the way, that's from this time that they started to elaborate a new charter, which eventually was published in 2017, that is radically different from the one they had in 1987. And if you look at the activities of Hamas since 2000, probably 3 or 4, when they started to be part of the regional local election, it's very hard to define a terrorist activity. And there is actually none. And that's one thing. Now, they resist, and they resist using weapons. And again, because you have people like Lindsey Graham who protect them, who provide this kind of a US umbrella, that's the reason why they don't need to make any effort to integrate into the even regional community. And when you talk about the Israeli diplomacy, it's inexistent, essentially. Israel had an effective diplomacy up to the early 70s. And you had a great Minister of Foreign Affairs. Again, I'm not saying they did everything right or so, but at least they had a diplomacy like Abba Eban and so on, who used to be real diplomats and tried to establish the positioning of Israel into the international community. But I said up to the early 70s. And look in times, that's the time in which the US started to protect Israel, the early 70s. Before that, the US was much more cautious about Israel. And that was definitely the case with the Kennedy administration, up to the Kennedy administration. People were very cautious. And if you hear the General de Gaulle, for instance, in France, who used to say that the Israelis are a small, arrogant people there's a famous press conference. I don't remember exactly the time. It was probably 1962 or something like that. I may be wrong on the date, but there's a famous speech he made about Israel, which you don't hear anymore because it is a description of Israel as nobody would dare to say today. And there is not the same law for everybody. Therefore, we see that it's a country that is totally, and somehow is something that's why it has also so many resolutions against him and all that, because it's a country that stands out of the international community, not because he's Jew, but because it misbehaves. Yeah. That's very important to say, because as soon as you criticize, you're anti-Semitic. And so, no, it's not that. I'm not judging the fact that you are Jew or not. I'm judging the fact that you behave or misbehave. And if you misbehave, I judge the misbehavior, and the misbehavior is beyond any rule, any humanity, any human sense that you may have. We expected after 1945 that the atrocities of World War II would not happen again. And we see that they not even happen again, but they are even worse. We should consider, and I speak from personal knowledge because my part of my family was in the French resistance during World War II. And one of my uncles, who used to be in French resistance in the south of France, was considered as terrorist by the Germans. We are exactly in the same situation. And I would say that probably my uncle was even more ruthless than the Hamas is. I can say that. So this idea of sticking and using the word terrorist as a pretext for not negotiating is, to my mind, first a mistake. And by the way, if we are honest, if we look at what Israel is doing by targeting deliberately civilians, by using inappropriate weapons that are mass destruction weapons, like heavy bombs and things like this, but also targeting individuals as they wait for food, like children, women, and all that. This equals terrorism. This is a clear example, and we don't have any example of similar behavior from the Hamas. If I would compare the use of word terrorism, if we apply it to Hamas or if we apply it to, there is no comparison. Israel is a terrorist state with no discussion. And I think this is something that everybody acknowledges today. While the Hamas, we use the word, but nobody, and I never heard anybody able to provide any example of that. The problem is that we still use the word, as I said, as a pretext for not negotiating. Although he was in a diplomatic mission, by the way, you had the downing of the KL 007 in the Sakhalin, over Sakhalin Peninsula in 1983, if I'm not wrong, which was a significant incident between the Soviet Union, Japan, and the West at large, because it was a civilian airliner that was downed by a Soviet fighter. So that was a significant incident. But although we had all these incidents, we always kept talking to each other. This never led to a break of the diplomatic relations. We always kept talking. There was condemnations, there were criticisms and all that. That was clear. But you still had a dialogue. You still had a negotiation. You had all these negotiations about the nuclear arsenal, the START negotiations, SALT negotiation, and all that. All these negotiations were, in fact, the expression of an existing dialogue, regardless of everything that could happen, and the antagonism and the support for terrorism that the Soviet Union did in many parts of the world, or the support to a guerrilla of a revolutionary movement in some area. So we know that this happened, but it didn't prevent this dialogue. How come have we been led into a situation as of today where we don't even dare to talk to each other? There's something that beyond my understanding, because the situation was to some extent much worse 50 years ago than it is today. But the Israelis are not, this is embedded into the culture, I would say, that you just kill people. And that makes the Israeli, on the one hand, extremely inefficient, effective, but inefficient. That means that they kill a lot of people, but they don't achieve the objective. But they're effective in killing people. And this is something that requires, in my view, much more thinking. And the problem with people like Lindsey Graham, by oversimplifying the problem, they tend to avoid any solution. And the problem with that is if we don't have any solution, that means that the situation will, in fact, degrade and worsen for both. But I think the determination of the Palestinians is stronger than the Israelis. And we have seen that, by the way, after those 12 days war, that the Israelis are much more vulnerable than the others. They don't have the determination. They are driven by hate, not by determination. Palestinians are driven not by hate, by determination. It's exactly the opposite. That's why the Palestinians are able to they manage to keep their resistance movement quite alive after 80 years, while the Israelis are not even able to sustain 12 days struggle. So that's what we see is a structural and intellectual weakness of the Israelis, which is, if we go deeper, which is based on a legitimacy weakness